Kia ora koutou. I really wanted this session to be about some of the challenges and decisions that you're likely to face in the coming years. I think it really helps to have a little bit of a heads up on those, and also to be looking at some of the practical strategies and tools that you can use for that decision making as you go through. So that's sort of the aim of this afternoon's session. It's really tricky to think, when you look back, how do you condense some of the learning into 3/4 an hour? So I've had to be quite specific about this topic, but I'll introduce a couple of segues along the way. I wanted to show you that photograph of my kids before and 7 years later, because I know we talk a lot about the things that are lying ahead, but sometimes it's hard to get concrete around what does that look like. I know for us, we heard it's going to be a marathon, not a sprint. These are the kinds of challenges you'll be facing. And it's like, well, what exactly is that going to look like for us at 2 or 3 years' time? You know, as a cognitive psychologist, it's all about how our mind operates. It's how we remember things, how we make decisions. And there's often this gap. We make a lot of our decisions based on past experience. And if you haven't experienced something like this before, it's very difficult to imagine. So when someone says you're still going to be in recovery at 5 years, it's really difficult to conjure that and imagine it in your mind. So I wanted to be a little bit more concrete in some of the examples, and to help visualise that for you. So hence the picture of the kids. I do a lot of work around self-care and around supporting supporters and looking after yourself. And people will say, get it at an abstract level, but then you get back into reality and things drop away. And sometimes you just need to show, well, here's my kids. For a big chunk of that time, there wasn't a lot of access to their mum. To try and give them a bit of an understanding of it's a big chunk of time in your kid's life, right? One of my first slides, and it's quite handy that Anne's covered it, is the recovery trajectory. Yep, so we're going to look at some really practical tools for decision making. So we really want to think about what are the challenges and decisions that you've got ahead. This is kind of giving you a jump start. I think it's really helpful because it can help prepare you practically, but also mentally for some of the decisions that are coming. Okay, so this is the slide that Anne helpfully showed. We found this incredibly helpful in Christchurch. And there's a couple of things that I would elaborate on. So Anne was talking about that adrenaline, and that's where we often talk about that action orientation, right, that Rob was talking about, how important it is that we just have all this energy that is being surging in your body. So essentially the biology of that is that we have different parts of our brain, and this is the nerdy side of the cognitive psychologist coming out, so bear with me for a second. And I'll go through it super quickly. But essentially what happens when we are under threat is that we use the very base part of our brain. Yeah, and that's when adrenaline gets pumped through your body. It's your body's way of knowing it needs to do everything it can to survive right now. So it's going to draw resources away from things that you don't typically need to survive the next hour, the next few minutes, the next day, whatever it is that you're trying to endure. And it's drawing them away so your blood is being moved from things like your digestion and your reproduction systems, because that can wait, right? We really want our muscles and our lungs and our hearts operating at their best to deal with threat. And the same sort of thing is happening in our brain. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but essentially what's happening is that we have this beautiful part of our brain that we use for very considered decision making. We are amazing as humans to think in quite abstract ways. We can weigh up different nuances. We can look at different options for decisions, right? We can problem solve. We can think creatively. We can be strategic. We can do all of these things that so many other species can't. But that happens in the frontal cortex of your brain. And when adrenaline is surging, it's drawing blood away from that area into your very base part of your brain around your hippocampus and I'm not going to get too technical. But essentially we're heading straight into that adrenaline state where we are all about action. And as Rob said, when you block that action because the problem cannot be immediately solved or a barrier comes into place, that's when you can expect emotion. So there's often a whole lot of adrenaline happening at this time, but then we really get into that stage where we're having to interact with bureaucracy. Right? And again, what does this look like? There's a whole lot of systems and processes that you may not have encountered yet, and what is that going to look like and mean for people? And I wanted to give you some concrete examples. But the last thing I wanted to do before I moved on to the concrete examples is to really indicate that actually it's quite helpful to put the end of the graph higher than the beginning, because as difficult as it can be through the middle stage, it's also an opportunity to grow from disaster, both individually and collectively as communities. Yeah? So secondary stress, I wanted to give you 3 really concrete examples, a way to illustrate what is this. So secondary stress is the disaster after the disaster. It's interacting with all those bureaucracies and systems that are also under strain and may not be designed necessarily for the environment that you're operating in. So sometimes it's business as usual systems that don't work, in a recovery setting particularly well. Or it's systems and processes being set up on the fly and under strain. So an example, in New Zealand, we had the Earthquake Commission, which is an earthquake insurer, and they traditionally had only worked with insurance companies who billed the clients. Suddenly after the event, they were having to front customers and they were having to scale up an unprecedented disaster in New Zealand. And suddenly they had to be customer facing and had needed hundreds of assessors and hundreds of people to respond. You can imagine that wasn't an easy system interacting with people who are affected. So the first concrete example I want to give you is from Sue Cunningham. So she was a survivor of the Black Saturday bushfires. She lost her partner. And this is a quote from her, and I'll let you read it. Does anyone would like me to read it? Anyone trouble with eyesight or anything? No? Let you just sit with that for a second. So it's what comes after is often the most difficult. Okay, has everyone read that one? Yeah, long up. And the second example this is something that after a lot of trial and error, trying to help communicate the realities for people in Wellington. So a lot of our decision makers sat in Wellington. A lot of the realities were happening on the ground in Christchurch. So in telling people, look, this is still really difficult for us as people living in Christchurch or as leaders in Christchurch a year on or 2 years on, it was really difficult for them to understand why it was still difficult for us. Like, how do you articulate that clearly? And so lots of different ways of trying, and being a cognitive psychologist, it's like, well, how do we make this a little bit easier to close the gap between what they have known in the past and something that they can't imagine? So this is my attempt and my little descriptor that often works quite well. So this is the job description of someone living recovery, right? So, my job, and this we take as an example, my job after the earthquakes suddenly became a whole lot more complicated, in a community support role. It was already, what it's like, shoestring, already quite challenging at the best of times, but suddenly it became all on, all day. It just burgeoned and was huge. And in the meantime, you're juggling, you're having to learn legalese to be able to work with insurance companies. It's a whole nother language that you may not ever have experienced. And in the middle of the night, quite literally one night, I came home from work at 11:30. My father, who was minding the kids for me, said, you had the call from the insurance company today. They're going to be here at 8 a.m. tomorrow morning. You need to have the house packed up. So literally at 3 a.m. in the morning, my father and I had head torches on, packing my children's room while they slept. So that whole idea of having to be removal contractors in the meantime, shifting our family multiple times for repairs. Being the site foreman, the project oversight of repairers coming and going at home. Having to be an on-road or off-road driving specialist to get our kids to school, was quite challenging for a while. I did literally lose the brakes in the driveway at one point with all the... also thinking about your kids and their concerns around how the education is going, so you're almost being a teacher aide, We became, and I imagine it's the same here, just in a different kind of context, but we became human Richter scales. We were really good at being able to say what size an aftershock was and which fault line it went. So I imagine you're similar, right, with learning and understanding the fire environment and then suddenly become experts in this area that you had no business in being experts in before. Being a PA for parents who are also having to go through, for older parents also going through the insurance process, and then being, I feel like I've missed one, no? And then being the amateur psychologist for your friends and family who are having a difficult time and having to listen and absorb their emotion and helping them through that as well. And I would add kind of a UN peacekeeper vest on that when things get kind of emotionally tatty at work and everybody's really tired and stressed. So just to try and paint a really concrete picture for people about what does that look like 2 or 3 years in, and so therefore what are the decisions you'll be making and how do you prepare yourselves for those decisions. And then the third example that we found really helpful actually came from Anne Leadbeater. So it came from my Winston Churchill Fellowship. Anne was one of the first people I spoke to. asking her, so just to go back to the genesis of that Winston Churchill Fellowship, what we found a year or two in, everybody was so tired, right? Everyone had been running so hard for so long that we started to see just exhaustion and burnout. It didn't matter whether you sat at a community table or whether you sat with government, we were seeing it at every level. And the issue that we're having is, well, how do we address that? Because in my work, we were putting in place everything we possibly could. As a psychologist and really embracing the importance of self-care and supporting our people, we put everything in place we possibly could, but we were still burning people out. So the Winston Churchill Fellowship for me was about how do we better support those working in disaster recovery in whatever form that takes. And one of the first people I spoke to was Anne, and I said, describe for me, how do you describe to people what the load is like, 1 or 2 years in? And she said to me quite helpfully, it's kind of like you've got a load of bricks that you already carry that just are life, right? You have responsibilities and you have things going on. And then the disaster comes and you get a whole lot more bricks added to your load. And then your work gets a whole lot, so all those things that I just talked you through in my job description, all of that stuff comes on to your load. You're carrying a whole lot more. And you can't put them down anytime soon. It goes on for a really long time. And then Jill might be having a really difficult time, so you're always the one that is super capable that everyone goes to, so you can have Jill's bricks too. And it just keeps going, and this load, and it's often quite invisible. We often think about the event itself, but this cumulative load can be quite invisible. And she said, and then, your boss might come to you or someone else might come to you and say, look, it's really important, Anne, that you look after yourself. Super, super important. But here's 3 more things I need you to do, right? So just helping people to understand the nature of recovery and that cumulative load is another really helpful analogy. The other thing when it comes to decision making, so the first thing is to have an awareness of what's ahead, yeah? And the second thing is to really understand, and we'll go through that a little bit more. I have a little exercise we'll do shortly. But the second thing is to really know what's going on in your brain. So this is a bit of Rob Gordon's territory, some of the stuff he talked about, which was really helpful. Is understand the stress, the biology of stress and how it affects your decision making. So this is kind of my, colleagues in cognitive psychology and other places in the world run all sorts of experiments. And essentially what they can do is they can artificially alter the cortisol levels, which is a stress hormone, in your bloodstream. And then they can test you on memory performance and various other things to see how your brain is operating, right? How your memory and your performance changes with different stress level hormones in your blood. And this is what we find. If you don't have enough stress, so really low stress levels, you get really low performance, which seems counterintuitive, right? We're always told stress is bad, yeah? But actually what happens is you need to care enough about something to really be invested in it. There's so many competing priorities that you're going to drop something off the list and go and focus on something else. We actually need to have enough invested. And a little bit of stress is a really good thing to help perform. So with just the right amount of stress, we hit peak performance. This is when we can make great decisions, we can perform well, we can just lift our game and be really proud of some of the things that we achieved even against the odds, which is some of the space that you really are in post-disaster, right? You're suddenly expected to do things you've never had to do, you're having to explore territory you've never explored before, you're in an uncomfortable situation. The thing with stress is essentially it's pushing on your comfort zones, which is uncomfortable and difficult, but that's how we grow. Right, it's also a space of growth. Yeah? And then what happens is if the stress is too great or goes on too long, our performance plummets. And so it's about understanding where you're at and where the people you are working with are at, and communities in your that you are working with are at as well. Understanding where does the stress hormone, where's it sitting for people, where are they on that end graph? And this is a very human thing, we all do this, yeah? So I think it's a really useful conversation to have around stress impacts, and actually we're all going to be in that bottom bit sometimes, right? And understanding where it is we're at so that we can hit that beautiful sweet spot. So here's my other sort of concrete way of explaining what happens in that time where you're using the base part of your brain instead of your beautiful cognitive, your cerebral cortex at the front. And essentially we are less able, because we're in that action mode that Rob talks about, we're much less able to be able to think strategically and to problem solve and to come up with ideas and just be able to look at things from different perspectives. And in recovery, you're making really incredibly important decisions, and not to be using that part of your brain is a real, step backwards. And so it's about understanding where you're at and trying to be in that space. But this is a short tongue-in-cheek video that shows you what we are like as humans when we're in that bottom bit at the end of the end graph.
Whoa, that's not good.
Oh, I don't need this. I'm already late.
Somebody will come. Anybody out there?
Do you have a phone?
No. Sorry. Somebody! Hello? There are 2 people stuck on an escalator and we need help. Now, would somebody please do something? Help! I don't believe this. You gotta be kidding me.
I'm gonna cry.
Well, there's nothing else left to do. That's it.
Hello? Hey, don't worry about it. I'll fix it in a second.
He said he can fix it. All right. All right. That's more like it. He says he can fix it.
So you can see that I really like finding really concrete ways of demonstrating some of the stuff and dealing with it. The other thing to know about decision making before we get into the practical tools is that we are very social creatures. So Rob was talking about us being part of communities. We think we're quite independent and we're quite capable of making decisions on our own, but actually we don't. Yeah? So all our decision making we tend to do in a social framework. So if you think about that, we tend to use those around us to gauge what's normal, what's desirable, yeah? And that influences our decision making. That's a really important part of how we make decisions. The second thing is collective efficacy. So really important after disaster is to try and encourage collective efficacy. So basically that means people having autonomy and control and being able to act and to do that together as a group. Yeah? So there's a lot of collective decision making that will happen after disaster. And the third thing that is really important with the social dimension is to really think about how do we create opportunities for people to connect. Because in doing so, we can, and we'll talk about this again in a minute, we can reduce their stress and we can help bring them into a better space for making decisions, and they will help work with each other, yeah, to problem solve, to come up with ideas and to look at ways forward. So the social element of decision making is really important to encourage. Okay. So I want to get into the really practical tools now, and the first is the cards for calamity. And that's these little fellas. You are all going to go away with one of these today. So that's courtesy of BRV, Bushfire Recovery Victoria, has donated one of these actually for everybody that has come today. So you'll get one for the workshop and then we'll send them out to others as well that are here today. But the genesis behind the cards are essentially Elizabeth McNaughton. She's my business partner. She's been involved in disasters since the Boxing Day tsunami, right? She says her career is quite literally a series of disasters. So between us, we've had more than 20 years of experience in disasters, and she says there's a lot of information. We've seen just how much relief there is to people when they have an understanding of what's ahead and what's normal. And how do we take some of that information, that learning from being an affected person to supporting people in community, Elizabeth's worked in government, all of those different areas, how do we help create some of the guidance from all the people we've spoken to around the world in disaster recovery, all the things people wish they'd known to help guide and make recovery just that little bit easier for people after an event. And so this is really important for 3 reasons. One is it's helpful for people to really see what's coming ahead. It's helpful to understand the challenges that are coming up, the sorts of decisions they might have to make. Yeah, it's really important for, in terms of, so firstly, it's helpful to know that it's really normal what people are facing too. Because the other thing we see, and we saw a lot in Christchurch, and I know for a while I was guilty of this too, we are the worst judge of ourselves, right? We can be a lot more compassionate with others, but we have this expectation around our own coping mechanisms and how we will cope and manage. And so when you have the inevitable impacts that you will see, then you often think, well, gosh, I'm not up to this what I thought I should be operating at. And what you get is a whole lot of people suffering quietly. Whereas actually when they know it's really normal, that's very expected, then you see a huge amount of relief lifted off people's shoulders. So it's about painting some of that picture for people as well. It brings down their stress levels, so then they too can make really good decisions. So that's the first thing, is knowing it's normal. The second thing is, one of the hardest things after disaster is the loss of power that people and control that people feel, right? In terms of, we have often a false idea in a Western culture that if we plan well, do all the right things, that everything will turn out great, and we have a lot of control and influence over our lives. We do actually have less than what we think, but that sense of power and control over your life is really important. And so providing people with information to help guide them, is really useful for bringing back people's sense of efficacy and giving them a bit of a heads up on what's ahead. And thirdly, these cards are often used, and I'll talk about this in a minute, but they're often used to bring people together to get a little bit deeper in conversation and connection and creating that social supports around people. But the first thing I want to do is... I got one more? Okay, sorry, pause. Sorry. So I just want to play a quick video. This is Anne-Marie.
Wow, this card here is really, really poignant. It all takes longer than anyone expects. And it's been heartbreaking to see people who work so hard to tick off all the practical tasks of rebuilding and recovery, only to find what truly matters to them lying in tatters, their relationships and their health. Life isn't something you can pause and get back to when you've finished all the tasks that disaster brings your way. What matters to you most, and how will you protect it? I had to come to this myself and come to this realisation myself, but I really wish someone had been able to sit me down and help me with that, because I've seen so many of my friends around me who haven't worked this out, and they're not together anymore, or their families have split up. And it is actually about working out what matters to you most. Being able to pull out something like this, it's really affirming to see your feelings written down on a piece of paper here and know that that's actually come from someone else as well. It's really affirming to know that your feelings are normal. And a lot of the things that are in here I've come to, it just would have been great to have seen it a lot earlier.
So I just want to hand some of these out. We're going to do just a quick activity with them. So I'm going to pass them, if you just pass them round, grab one each, and then if there's still some left at the end, pass them back for a second round. And what we're going to do is lay out, I'll start that off. We're going to lay out the rope to form, to form the graph on the floor here. So we'll get you to all stand and move, because I feel like there's been a lot of sitting this morning. So once you get your cards, to come forward, and we're going to lay some of the cards out on the rope to sort of depict the journey that's ahead for people. get abused for how I abuse rope. So I hope there's not an emergency management person here. Paul, do you mind just laying that rope out on the floor that looks a little bit like this, and you might have some left over, and that's okay.
Just give me a second.
Yeah, go for it. So in the meantime, I want you to just think about your cards and think about where on that graph they might fit. Some of them don't fit in anywhere in particular. You can put them anywhere you like. You know, some of them will be really obvious as to where they sit. And what you're looking at, you'll all have a different one. The tips, tricks, and tales, the stories and guidance from people around the world who have been through disaster in various forms. And as I talked about before, actually, it's really tricky because our communities are so unique and our disaster circumstances are so unique. But as Rob and Anne said, there are some parallels, there are some commonalities that are really useful to know and understand. And I think it's helpful to take that and think, okay, you have the freedom of choice to pick and choose the things you think will work in your communities, leave behind the other things, to adapt things for your communities, and to use some of these resources to really support the great people in your local communities and the great initiatives that are happening. Oh, look at this. Great teamwork going on. So I knew there'd be someone who knows about ropes and knots. It's not me. Okay, someone got a card that they particularly wanted to share that resonates with them for some reason? Yep. Bring you the mic.
So this one reads, after the disaster, with everything that needed doing, I just didn't stop and eventually my health suffered. I kept getting sick and just made everything harder. The aha moment was realising that my health had to be first on my list if I was to be able to meet any of my other priorities. So with what we've been doing, we've been going for 7.5 weeks with bushfire relief recovery for food packages for families. And we're literally working 7 days a week, 10 to 15 hour days, unpacking pallets, repacking and repacking food, and it's really starting to take a toll that this week we've sort of rearranged the hours, rearranged the volunteers and everything else, and had to take a step back so that we could still work and function in a way that supported the community, but we weren't dropping the ball because we were trying to go too fast, too hard.
Does anyone want to come and lay their cards on the... Are we at that kind of time where everyone just needs lunch? No? Come and lay your cards down on the rope if you can. If there's anyone who wants to read their card as they do it, let me know. Or hold on to the... Yep, nice, thanks. Come and read it here as well, read both.
My neighbour had started to go on and on about her cat, her crying freakouts over her cat. It keeps going missing, it's not eating, etc. were too much with everything else I had going on. It pooed in my garden, and I even felt a warm glow at the idea of it wandering off. I was moaning about it when my friend pointed out that my neighbour had lost a wee boy a few years back, and that perhaps the flood had triggered that trauma for her. Fear of losing her cat might be tied up with the loss of her baby. That's from Rob in England during a flood.
Has anyone else got one that I'd like to read? So you get a real mix there. You get the whole adrenaline state and the action. There's some really positive stuff going on. There's some pretty challenging times going on. And there's a lot of, I think it's really useful to know, there's a lot of beautiful growth that is possible because it can all feel pretty bleak, especially when you're in the bottom of that trough. Yeah. So for me, I know with my kids, I've seen some impacts of the earthquakes on them. How could they not?
This is your one.
Oh, yeah, go on then. You read that. Perfect.
But now time has passed, my kids have developed skills to deal with life's rough patches. They have more empathy, they're less absorbed with the trivial. I'm so proud of the people they've become. Jolie, New Zealand.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. And when you're in the depths down here, it can be hard to know that there's a lot of growth, both as individuals, as families, and as communities, collective growth as well, that is really possible. And I think that's important to hold on to and to aim for. And it's just about planning for some of the stuff in the middle so we can make that trough a little bit less steep and we can help support people and stay connected as much as we can through that trough. Yeah? So this gives you a sense, the reason these cards are important is it helps people understand what's ahead, what they might plan for. There's a lot of questions that people can be asking themselves to guide their own decisions. So it's not about saying how to do recovery. Different things will resonate with people at different times, and it's just fodder for thought for their own, guiding their own recovery. So that's the first tool that I wanted to share with you. The second one is, I'm just going to do this super briefly because you all got one on your seats. And this is courtesy of Australian Red Cross, had these printed for us, which I'm super grateful for. But essentially this is the wisdom from disaster leaders from around the world, from both Elizabeth's, Winston Churchill and mine. And we brought in a third author, David Lallemon, who is an engineer at Stanford but has done a lot of work in disasters around the world, including 9/11 and Haiti, because we thought we needed a bit of diversity of thought in there. So, and here, this is important because I think it gives you more confidence in your decision making as leaders. And I think too, there's a lot of questions in here. There's no one way to do recovery. The way that's going to be right for your community is going to be different for other people. So there's a lot of questions here that really can help. I think asking the right questions of yourself and others at the right time is a really important tool that you can use to guide your decisions. So you'll get one of those to take away. Yep. Sorry, yes, yep. And the third one I wanted to introduce you to was, and again, it was like, what do you squeeze into 3/4 an hour, an hour? And there's a whole workshop that could be done on how do we support people like yourselves who are working in recovery. And there's two components to it, right? There's a huge amount of things that can be done to support and guide and support you and what you're doing, but also there's the component of how do you look after yourselves. But it's not like that you can look after yourself and then people keep adding bricks to you, like Anne was talking about. It's got to be both. And one thing that is for sure that we've learned, and so many of us have learned the hard way, is that when it comes to you being able to sustain yourselves, to be able to make good decisions through time and not be on that escalator stuck, at really critical times in a couple of years' time, to be able to sustain yourself, to be able to keep contributing in a really positive way, then you're going to have to be really intentional about looking after yourself so you can keep doing this work. Hope is not a method, when it comes to self-care and well-being and resilience. So we've created this very practical tool, and feel free to come and talk to me about it. I could spend probably 5 or 10 minutes taking you through the different themes, but it's essentially all the things that we know that we wished we really had to be able to look after our own people and to look after ourselves. And it's really important because I think that intentionality around looking after ourselves, it's about hitting that beautiful green spot, be able to manage our stress and well-being. And it's a very fine line between damage and growth, in this work. It's a very fine line at all, and we want to try and do whatever we can to head towards the growth stage. So I just want to show to you from that research that I did, this is the very real impacts that people said working in recovery had on them. This isn't abstract, this is their self-reported impacts that they had experienced or others close to them experienced. And this is the impacts on the organisations or the community groups that they worked for. And this is if people are not supported well and if they don't look after themselves well. So again, it's both. But the good news is, as we talk about growth, actually the flip side of that, the growth that comes from this work is just phenomenal. It'll be one of the most meaningful jobs and roles that you'll ever play. The amount of growth that comes from understanding what it is that you can endure, from learning new skills. It goes on and on. Honestly, the growth that is possible is quite amazing. But you have to be quite intentional about steering towards growth and away from damage. All right. I wanted to just leave you with a couple of things. I'll hand these out in a second. But from that Winston Churchill research, there are 12 principles of support. These are the 12 things that people said were really helpful, or they wish they had in terms of support to their roles, so that they could really do the best job they could in supporting others in recovery. So there's 12 principles here, and you'll see quotes from people around the world Just to give you an example, maybe a little bit more concrete. This here can be downloaded from that website there. This is the full report. It's not as scary as it looks, it's about half appendices, and the first half is about 20 or 30 pages in there around these explained a whole lot more. So if anyone wants to come and check this out, otherwise you can get it from the website, and we'll send you away with each one of these. Through the resilience journey. Come and see me if you want that explained. And that's a very helpful tool that's been used in all sorts of areas of stress, prolonged stress in particular in New Zealand, not just in disasters at the moment. It's being used in the likes of the agriculture sector who are facing a really changed environment and increased stress of their farmers. Okay, so really important for you guys is to enlist your support crew. When it comes to decision making, you're not going to be able to hold the perspective by yourself all the way through. Make sure you have a really great crew around you. And I just want to leave you with two last things. Firstly is that a challenge really and a wish for you. So you are really, I know you're facing the most challenging times the next couple of years, right? It seems like a huge challenge that you have ahead. But in some ways, it's a horrible opportunity, right? If we think it's a chance to hit reset on some things and really examine our communities and our processes and our systems and how things work and do things in a way that's better, fairer, safer. So I want to wish you all the best with that. And the second thing that I would say in terms of my own personal advice is think about what is the thing in your life that you really want to protect most over the next few years. If you think about the photos of those kids at the beginning, what do you want to protect most as you go through this support to your communities? And make sure it's on your to-do list, in some way, even a tiny way each and every day. Because otherwise your recovery to-do list, it doesn't let up for any time soon. So make sure the important things that you want to protect are there. Thank you. You've done well, because I know that lunch, you must all be pretty starving by now. Feel free to bail me up if you have any questions. I want to hand out each of those handouts that you can take away and a box of cards for Calamity for you, but yeah, I'm around and available for the rest of the day. So thank you.